I never thought I'd get into a full-blown war with a homeowners association over heat, but here we are. Picture it. Minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit outside. The kind of cold that bites through your coat and makes your coffee steam faster than you can drink it. And suddenly my heat just stops working. One minute my thermostat is humming along. The next minute it's as dead as my patience. I looked at the screen, hoping it was a glitch, maybe a breaker, anything. Nope. Dead. And then it hit me. They cut it off. The HOA. In the middle of what felt like the apocalypse. I stared at the thermostat, incredulous, imagining the email I would have to send. Dear HOA, why am I freezing? Seemed too polite, too weak, and yet any other action felt like it would make me the villain in a story I didn't ask to be a part of. I wrapped myself in blankets, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it would get warm soon. It didn't. I could hear the pipes in the walls groaning under the cold, my cat huddling in the corner like she had decided the world was over, and I sat there thinking, what the hell am I going to do about this? I spent the next few hours pacing, checking the emails, the notices, even calling the HOA office. The woman on the other end, Karen, said in a tone like she was reading a script, "Your heat is off per association guidelines. You'll have to wait until the issue is resolved." And I'm sitting there thinking, issue resolved? It's minus 15. I could see frost forming on the window sills, my beard slowly icing over. And all she could say was, wait. Wait while I freeze. Wait while the pipes risk bursting. Wait while my kids shiver under multiple blankets. And that's when the idea hit me. I couldn't just wait. I couldn't just suffer silently. I needed to respond. Not like a criminal, not like a threat, but creatively, cleverly, and in a way that made them realize just how ridiculous it was to cut someone's heat in the dead of winter. And as I plotted, a grin formed on my face. Not a mean grin, not a destructive grin, but the kind of grin you get when you know you're about to level the playing field in a way that's both harmless and unforgettable. I started by observing. The HOA office wasn't far from my place, and I spent the next few days noting patterns. I didn't need to be a spy, not really, but just enough to understand when and how they managed the gas for multiple homes. They controlled 42 homes directly, so any action needed precision. I didn't want to hurt anyone, not physically, not anyone innocent, but I wanted the message to be felt. The people who had the power to make me freeze needed to experience a fraction of that same discomfort, strategically, safely. I began sketching ideas on paper while sipping coffee, imagining layouts of valves, meters, and control panels, making mental notes about timing, coordination, and legality. It wasn't about revenge in the violent sense. It was about proportional response. They cut my heat. I made sure they felt what it's like to be at the mercy of the very system they controlled. And I started to plan the steps meticulously, from timing to execution, all while staying within limits that would avoid real danger. During this planning stage, my kids noticed my distraction. "Dad, are you mad at the HOA again?" my youngest asked, eyes wide. I smiled faintly, trying to explain. Sometimes, when someone treats you unfairly, you have to think smart, not just shout. You have to be clever. And honestly, that was the truth. I wanted to teach them a lesson too, not about retaliation in the violent sense, but about strategy, observation, patience, and the satisfaction of doing things with forethought. By the third day, I was ready. I double-checked my notes, memorized patterns, confirmed timing, and even rehearsed movements, like a conductor preparing for a symphony of mild inconvenience. I wasn't angry anymore in the way that consumes you. I was focused, methodical, excited about the brilliance of a harmless but unforgettable lesson. The whole time, the thermometer on my wall reminded me that waiting passively wasn't an option. My family was cold, frustrated, and anxious, and I could not let that slide. I started small. I implemented minor changes to the systems that would gently restrict gas flow, subtle enough to be noticed immediately, but safe enough to avoid real damage. I imagined Karen, sitting in the office, realizing something wasn't right with the 42 homes under her watch. I imagined her confusion, the complaints starting to trickle in, the panic of an unexpected disruption. And I smiled, because it was happening exactly as I had visualized. A perfectly calibrated, clever disruption that sent a clear message. You don't get to freeze people just because you can. Neighbors began noticing. Calls started coming in, complaints buzzing like bees, and for the first time, I saw the subtle shift. The power dynamic. usually entirely in the HOA's favor, began to feel different. They were scrambling, reacting, checking panels, double-checking schedules, and realizing that for once, they were not in control. And that feeling, that quiet satisfaction, was something I hadn't felt in a long time. The realization that cleverness, forethought, and a little technical understanding could level the playing field in a very real, very effective way. By the end of the first week, it was clear my message had landed. 42 homes experienced minor gas interruptions, enough to feel the chill and discomfort I had endured, without anyone being harmed. The HOA was scrambling, flustered, their control disrupted, and I could finally feel warmth returning, not just from the restored heat in my own home, but from the satisfaction of seeing systems, rules, and arrogance bend under clever planning. And it wasn't just about comfort. It was about principle. It was about showing that abuse of authority has consequences, even in subtle, nonviolent ways. I realized that this story, my story, was as much about strategy, observation, and patience as it was about revenge. And I knew that one day, maybe I'd tell this story, sitting in a warm house, watching snow drift outside, and laugh at how something as mundane as heat and gas could turn into a lesson no HOA would forget. The following days felt like walking a tightrope over a frozen river. I had the plan, I had the notes, and I had the sheer necessity driving me forward. My family was cold, the house was uncomfortable, and the HOA had to learn, in some small, calculated way, what it felt like to be powerless in a system they thought they controlled. I checked, rechecked, and triple-checked the schedules for gas distribution across the 42 homes. Every meter, every valve, every timing detail mattered. One mistake, and someone could have been legitimately harmed, and that was not my goal. The goal was to create discomfort, awareness, and a lesson that would stick. The first subtle disruption was almost anticlimactic, but the effect was immediate. A few homes noticed the heat dipping slightly, thermostats behaving erratically. Calls started trickling into the HOA office, and I could almost hear Karen's voice, calm and scripted on the phone, reassuring residents that everything is being checked, when in reality, the system had just learned that control can be temporary. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee, trying not to grin too widely. Even the cat gave me a look like, "You're insane," and maybe she was right. But strategy often feels a little insane when you're executing it perfectly. By midweek, the pattern was clear. Minor, safe interruptions spread like ripples across the system. Each homeowner under HOA control experienced a small inconvenience, enough to notice, enough to check their thermostats, enough to call in and report problems, but never enough to create real danger. And the reactions? Oh, the reactions were priceless. I imagined Karen pacing the office, muttering, "How is this happening? Did someone hack the system?" While residents grew more and more anxious about the cold inside their homes. It wasn't malicious, it was poetic justice. They had frozen my family, and now, indirectly, the discomfort ricocheted back to them. One evening, I stood on my porch, watching the sunset reflect off the snowy rooftops, thinking about the scale of what I had orchestrated. 42 homes, all experiencing just enough to feel a subtle chill, all calling the HOA, and the office staff scrambling. It wasn't violence, it wasn't destruction, it wasn't even confrontation, it was cleverness, and it was completely harmless. And I realized that part of the satisfaction wasn't just the inconvenience I had created, but the lesson being absorbed. They didn't need a lecture. They didn't need an argument. They were learning it themselves. The next morning, Karen called me. I didn't pick up, but I could hear her voice echoing through the voicemail. "Please call the office immediately. There seems to be an issue with the gas lines affecting multiple units." And I smiled. I didn't leave a message. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The system itself had spoken, and it had delivered my message perfectly. Sometimes the best revenge is quiet, invisible, and yet undeniable. Of course, the HOA wasn't entirely passive. I saw technicians coming and going, inspecting panels, checking valves, consulting each other in urgent whispers. They were scrambling, trying to understand why the system was behaving differently. And I could almost see the realization dawning. This was not a random glitch. This was a pattern. And somewhere in that realization, I felt the subtle thrill of victory. I wasn't just inconveniencing them. I was making them face the consequences of their own decisions. My family noticed the difference, too. My kids giggled as I explained, vaguely. Sometimes adults make mistakes, and sometimes we have to teach them lessons in clever ways. I didn't go into specifics. They were too young, but the principle stuck. It wasn't about anger or hate. It was about patience, strategy, and understanding that sometimes the system itself can become an instrument of learning when wielded wisely. By midweek, the ripple effects were becoming more apparent. The HOA started sending messages to residents. Technicians were checking and rechecking lines, and the board was holding emergency meetings. All without ever knowing who was behind the subtle adjustments. All without realizing the lesson had been carefully engineered. And I sat back, watching it unfold, thinking about how sometimes the most effective actions are invisible until the moment they become undeniable. One particularly cold morning, I watched a resident's heating system behave erratically for the third time in a week. They called the office, and the technician arrived to check, only to find everything mechanically perfect. But the system had learned my little tweaks, minor, safe, intentional, and the patterns of frustration were spreading. I imagined them in their homes, feeling just enough cold to be reminded of my own plight, and I felt a strange satisfaction. Not cruelty, not malice, just justice delivered with creativity and intelligence. And then came the high point, the moment I had been waiting for. Karen herself walked through the office that afternoon, phone glued to her ear, muttering under her breath, trying to coordinate responses to 42 different complaints. I could hear her exasperation from my window, her voice taut with frustration, and I realized this was the culmination of everything I had planned. She was experiencing, at a fraction of the scale, the helplessness my family had endured, and it was elegant in its simplicity. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't broken rules. I hadn't endangered anyone. I had simply used observation, timing, and subtlety to deliver a lesson they would remember. Over the next few days, the disruption continued in minor waves, enough to maintain the pressure, enough to let the HOA understand that their actions had consequences. And the beauty of it was in the restraint. Nothing was permanent, nothing was unsafe, nothing was cruel. It was cleverness applied with care, and every minor inconvenience was a message wrapped in subtlety. I could see Karen checking systems obsessively, residents calling repeatedly, and the board meetings getting tense. They were feeling the echoes of their own decision to cut my heat, and that realization, that awareness, was immensely satisfying. By the end of the week, patterns had stabilized. The HVAC systems returned to normal, complaints subsided, and the HOA had effectively learned the lesson without ever confronting me directly. 42 homes had felt the effect, subtly, safely, undeniably. My house was warm again, my family comfortable, and I could finally relax. And as I watched snow drift gently past the window, I realized something profound. Sometimes, indirect actions, creativity, and careful observation can be more powerful than confrontation, more effective than anger, and far more satisfying than a shouting match. It wasn't just about payback, it was about principle, about fairness, about using intelligence, planning, and subtlety to correct an injustice. And as the week drew to a close, I felt a calm satisfaction, knowing that a lesson had been delivered, learned, and absorbed, without a single raised voice or threatened action. And that, for me, was far more rewarding than any dramatic showdown ever could be. By the time the weekend rolled around, everything had quieted down a little, but I knew the HOA wasn't truly back in control yet. Karen and her team were still running around the office, double-checking reports, comparing logs, and I could almost hear her muttering, "How is this possible? There's nothing wrong, and yet the complaints keep coming." And I had to bite back a laugh because it was exactly what I had hoped for, the tiniest hint of panic, the realization that their attempt to control everything wasn't as absolute as they thought. I spent that Saturday morning outside, sipping coffee on the porch, watching the neighborhood wake up, and noticing how even minor adjustments to schedules or settings could ripple through 42 homes. Residents were calling, sending emails, looking for answers, while the HOA scrambled, trying to maintain the illusion of authority. And it struck me then, the thrill wasn't just in the revenge itself. It was in seeing the system, the rules, and the people enforcing them, confronted with a reality they hadn't accounted for. By Monday, the pattern was clear. The HOA had restored my heat, of course, but the lesson had landed in ways I couldn't control. They were more cautious now, double-checking procedures, thinking twice before making unilateral decisions. Residents had a story to tell, a cautionary tale about how even small actions by those in power can have consequences. And for me, that was the most satisfying part. Not just winning, not just comfort restored, but the knowledge that fairness, clever planning, and restraint can sometimes be more effective than anger, confrontation, or threats. I remember watching Karen finally sit down at her desk one afternoon, exhausted, papers scattered everywhere, phone to her ear, explaining to a resident that everything is fine now, the system is stable. And I could almost imagine her thinking, somewhere in the back of her mind, maybe cutting someone's heat in the middle of freezing temperatures wasn't the best decision. Maybe there's a cost to exercising authority thoughtlessly. And that, subtle as it was the real victory. My kids, of course, thought the whole situation was hilarious. "Dad, you totally got them back," my youngest whispered one evening, eyes wide, barely able to contain a giggle. And I smiled because, in some ways, that's exactly what it was, a lesson in strategy, patience, and clever thinking, delivered without harm, delivered without confrontation, delivered in a way that made the lesson stick. They understood it was about fairness, not vengeance, about using your mind, rather than your fists to solve problems. Over the next week, I noticed small changes in the neighborhood. The HOA seemed more cautious, more deliberate, and even the residents were subtly more aware of how powerful the systems they relied on could be. And it hit me then. Small conflicts, even as mundane as a heating system dispute, reveal so much about human behavior: arrogance, control, respect, patience, and the consequences of ignoring others. My story wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a case study in subtlety, strategy, and ethical problem-solving. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and snow glittered softly on the roofs, I sat on the porch and reflected. 42 homes had felt a disruption. Minor, safe, strategic, but the lesson had been delivered. The HOA had learned something without anyone getting hurt, without shouting, without legal threats, without drama in the traditional sense. And for me, that quiet, clever victory was more satisfying than any confrontation could ever be. And yet, the story isn't neatly over. Karen still glanced nervously at logs, still triple-checked systems before making decisions, still knew that there's always a potential for disruption when authority is exercised without consideration. That subtle caution, that change in behavior, is a reminder that lessons can be learned without conflict, that consequences can be applied cleverly, and that respect for others is rarely demanded, it's earned. So here's the takeaway, the part one really want people to think about. Sometimes, small injustices feel trivial, like a minor inconvenience or a technical decision. But they reveal character, power dynamics, and human behavior. And the way you respond can make all the difference. You can escalate, argue, or retaliate with anger, or you can think strategically, act creatively, and deliver a lesson that is both effective and ethical. I chose the latter, and it worked perfectly. Now it's your turn. What would you do if your heat was cut in the middle of minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit and your family was freezing? Would you call the HOA repeatedly? Take legal action? Or would you find a clever, safe way to make your point, to assert fairness without causing real harm? Comment below, share your stories, and let's have a discussion about boundaries, fairness, and creative problem solving. Who's right? Who's wrong? And is cleverness a better teacher than confrontation? I want to hear your opinions. And remember, sometimes the best victories aren't loud. They aren't dramatic. They don't require confrontation or rage. They are quiet, strategic, clever, and entirely undeniable. That's the kind of victory that stays with you, the kind that teaches lessons to others without leaving scars, the kind that makes life just a little more interesting. And as I sit here, sipping my coffee in a warm house, watching the snow fall outside, I know this story will be remembered, not for anger, but for intelligence, patience, and the satisfaction of doing things the right way, creatively and thoughtfully.